Welcome to this episode of ASCOR Explainer series. My name is Setenay Hizliok. I am an analyst at the Transition Pathway Initiative Centre based at London School of Economics. In this episode, I will walk you through the climate legislation area in the ASCOR framework. The ASCOR framework is built on three pillars. Each of these pillars assesses a different aspect of country climate performance. Climate legislation is located under the second pillar as one of the climate policy areas. If you're interested in learning more about any other areas in the ASCOR framework, please have a look at the ASCOR framework methodology note from the link below the table. In this video, I will briefly touch on the definition and importance of climate legislation. Then I will provide some brief information on how we assess climate legislation in ASCOR. And finally, I will share some highlights from our 2024 assessment results. There are several points that make climate legislation an important area in terms of assessing national climate change policy. First, climate laws can support countries in delivering their mitigation and adaptation commitments. They do this by setting a legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for national climate action in the country. Legislation are harder to amend compared to executive policy documents. Therefore, they ensure policy stability over a longer term. When there are such legislation in place, they often introduce relevant monitoring and accountability mechanisms for climate-related obligations, and this enhances the accountability and credibility of national commitments. There are some common characteristics of climate legislation that help us to define and identify a climate framework law. First, it needs to set a strategic direction for national climate change policy. This can be mitigation, adaptation, setting a net zero target, or a combination of such directions. Second, it needs to be passed by the legislative branch of the government. However, in particular political systems, there may be some exceptions to this rule. And finally, it needs to set at least one climate-related obligation. This obligation can be introducing a climate policy instrument, like carbon pricing, publishing national climate strategies or plans, or setting and meeting some mitigation targets. In ASCOR, we assess climate legislation through two indicators. First, we assess if the country has a climate framework law or equivalent, and then we assess if the country's climate framework law establishes relevant accountability mechanisms. When assessing the first indicator to identify if the country has a climate framework law or equivalent, we first look at climate-related legislation in the country to see if they meet the three criteria we just went through when we were defining and identifying a climate framework law. So let's quickly remember what they were: setting a strategic direction, being passed by the legislative branch, and setting a climate-related obligation. If the country has a climate legislation that meets all these three criteria, it qualifies for the first indicator. In some cases, countries may have equivalent practices for this. For example, they may have a broader environmental or sustainability law that was amended with climate-specific provisions. Or in other cases, they may have a combination of an environmental law and a directly linked executive document, and these two can meet all three criteria when they come together. Secondly, we assess if the climate framework law of the country specifies relevant accountability elements. And here we have another set of three criteria. First, we assess if the law specifies who is accountable to whom in terms of climate-related obligations established in the law. So this could be accountability of the Ministry of Environment or Climate to Parliament, for example, in terms of setting a mitigation target or publishing a national climate policy. Secondly, we assess if the law specifies how the compliance is assessed with respect to climate-related obligations. This could be some monitoring and reporting mechanisms established in the law. And finally, we assess if the law specifies what would happen if one of the obligate parties failed to meet with their obligation. Examples here can include parliamentary intervention, judicial orders, or financial penalties. In our 2024 assessment results, we observed that 57% of 70 countries we assessed have passed a climate framework law. Some of these countries have multiple climate framework laws. We also observed that 41% of countries have a climate framework law that specifies all the relevant accountability elements. Now let's take a journey throughout the timeline of the climate framework laws we identified in 40 countries. As you can see from this timeline, Japan was the first country that adopted a climate framework law, and this was right after the country hosted the United Nations Conference of Parties in Kyoto, where Kyoto Protocol was adopted. Similarly, France has adopted its first climate framework law within the same year that the country hosted the Conference of Parties in Paris, where Paris Agreement was adopted. We observed that climate framework laws have proliferated since the Paris Agreement. We have identified some emerging good practices during our assessments. In most of the cases, a climate framework law sets a strategic direction towards mitigation, and this is often accompanied by adaptation within the same law. However, Japan and Germany have passed dedicated climate framework laws for their national adaptation policy. Secondly, we observed that when setting an accountability mechanism, many countries specify what would happen when a private party, such as a company, does not meet their climate-related obligation. Some countries, including New Zealand, Nigeria, and South Africa, state what would happen if the government itself fails to meet their obligations, such as meeting a goal to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. If you are interested in learning more about any other areas in the ASCOR framework and watch the rest of the ASCOR Explainer series, please have a look at our website. Thank you for watching.